Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Небо утреннего стяг в жизни важен. Первый шаг, слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It is the 7th of November 2023. It is, of course, 106 years since the October Revolution of 1917, and thus we celebrate with a slightly expanded musical introduction featuring the Russian song from the 1970s as suggested by our regular viewer, Irish Partisan, which is entitled And the Battle is Going Again, and the North Korean DPRK song, Reunification. That was the last one you heard there. So, I hope you enjoyed that. I may add more to it if there is enthusiasm for several minutes of revolutionary music before we begin. So, I will just do a quick roll call through the chat. So, James Graham, good evening to you. Peter, all the way from Perfidious Albion, good evening to you. And Solidarity to Muzzle Paint. And Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, and suggester of one of those tunes. And President Jesus, Citizen Skriv, good evening. I'm glad you're able to catch this stream. Lee, good evening to you. Klavek, good evening to you. And Carmo, all the way from the Wirral. And Beju, hello to you, comrade. And Ben Kavanagh, good evening to you as well. And Ulieni, hello from the USA. Karen Mendes, hello to you. And we will begin. We are, of course, live on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble, so you can catch us on all of those. Due to the fact that YouTube can pull the plug at any second, it's always best to have a backup plan. So, we begin tonight with, well, some news that there appears to have been a uptick, shall we say, in the Israeli bombardment of South Lebanon this night, and this appears to be an escalation. We will see what this leads to, whether it is a coherent plan on the part of the Israelis or whether this is some kind of action that won't lead to anything more than has happened already. But bear in mind, there is an important speech scheduled from Hassan Nasrallah on the 11th. That's 4 days' time, on Saturday of this week, where he will speak again. And I anticipate that he will probably announce something new, perhaps a further escalation in Hezbollah's response to US imperialist aggression. Let's just have this completely right, because this is essentially the subject of our program tonight, which is, of course, who is ultimately in charge of the US-Israeli relationship. Now, it shouldn't really take even a Marxist-Leninist to analyze this properly, but there's so much disinformation, genuine disinformation, and piss-poor analysis done on this question. I thought it best to spend the hour on this question and this question alone. Now, to give an indication as to the kind of thing I'm arguing against this evening, this is the take that is put out there by the likes of John Mearsheimer. He has indulged in this. The likes of Scott Ritter has gone down this road recently. And it's not just people in the United States or people you might think of as being from the American political right wing who are engaged in this. It's people like Matt Kennard over at Declassified UK, an outlet which does an awful lot of good work, but with which I think it's fair to say many of us of the Marxist-Leninist persuasion would have serious issues with the way in which they present things. Their coverage of the Labour Party is opportunistic and sows illusions that the Labour Party could ever be anything other than what it is, which is a party that is a long-standing, trusted, safe pair of hands for British imperialism. And Kennard and others of his school of thought, if you can call it that, want you to believe that at some point it wasn't, or at some point it got worse. It didn't get any worse or any better. It just remained the same, of course. And he has also pointed out that he's made this point that, drawing on the diaries of Alan Duncan, a former Conservative Party Foreign Office minister, that when Duncan said that the Israelis think that they run the Foreign Office, and indeed they do. Now, it should be pointed out that Alan Duncan is a man with a background in the oil industry and with a work history of connections with oil-producing states in the Middle East. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant because Duncan represents a particular minority school of thought within the bourgeois that is reflected within some of the divisions around within the bourgeois system about Israel, which is that some of them, a minority of them, particularly those connected with the oil industry, do see Israel as, or more to the point, the alliance or the investment of the British in the Israel project as being a hindrance to oil deals with the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and other places, that it gets in the way of doing business. And that particular school of thought is represented by people like Alan Duncan. Now, this is, of course, taking the word of a Tory minister who represents the minority school of thought within the British bourgeois. Now, it's interesting that he would put that observation in his diary, but it's not a guide to a correct analysis of the relationship between Britain and Israel, or between the US and Israel. Now, in order to demonstrate what I'm talking about here, I'm going to need to go back into the history again, and go back even before the modern-day Zionist movement was founded, to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Now, why is it, for instance, that Lord Palmerston, former legendary British Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister in the middle part of the 19th century, suddenly became in favour of first Christian settlements in what's commonly referred to as the Holy Land or Palestine? And that's the question that we should pose straight away, because Palmerston and others did become in favour of the establishment of certain Christian settlements in the Holy Land, and that was basically done in order to capitalise on the sort of fundamentalist Protestant movement that wanted to do a return to the land of Christ, and to have them settle there in order to be able to then proclaim that you, as a Christian nation, as in the British Empire, had the sacred right to protect the Christian settlers in Palestine. And for that reason, we had the right to, the British had the right to send gunboats to threaten the Ottoman Empire, which of course was decaying and declining, and the British had their eyes on Ottoman territories. So that's the first example I wanted to mention here. Was it that Palmerston was the shadowy mastermind here, or abiding by some sort of religious mania? Was this what he was after? Or was it that he was using the religion aspect here to cover a certain other agenda, which is that the British Empire was always willing to use certain religious minorities or religious elements to do what it always did, which is rule by sowing division, sowing confusion, and creating divisions wherever it could, and then inserting itself as the so-called peacemaker. That's a classic tactic that the British used an awful lot in the colonial period in India, which is, if they weren't fighting themselves directly via the army of the East India Company, they'd try and turn the various Indian princely states against each other and then insert themselves as the moderator. This is a very old tactic, and it's one that the British continue to use. So I'm starting with that example of Palmerston in the mid-19th century, because with the decay of the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French, and to a certain extent later on the newly unified Germany, all had their eyes on what would be valuable pieces of real estate. And the British had their eyes on Palestine and also Iraq as these represented key stopping points or key points to be controlled on the path to India. Remember, India was the absolute center of the British Empire, and it was particularly after the loss of the American colonies in the Revolution of 1776, the focus on India was redoubled. So this was the prime profit center of the British Empire, and therefore everything that was revolved around protecting the sea lanes to this and also protecting the land routes to it. This is the reason they got involved in the so-called Great Game against Tsarist Russia. They came to believe that the Russian Tsar was harboring designs on India. And that's why they, in the 1840s, first tried to establish British control over Afghanistan with disastrous consequences. So they had their eyes on the lands of the old Ottoman Empire as it was in decline, precisely because they wanted to protect the routes to India. This is the big reason. And this is why they started an association with the Zionist movement. Now remember, in the early 20th century and late 19th century, the Zionist movement is the minority position in European and global Jewry. It is regarded by many as a movement of fanatics and cranks, and its principal theoretician, as I've said before, Theodor Herzl, was a frustrated petty bourgeois right-winger from Austro-Hungary. And this is part of the reason why he got involved in Zionism, was because his political career was thwarted. And the British, of course, seeing an opportunity in World War I to further their long-standing aim to seize not just Palestine, but also what's now known as Iraq from the Ottoman Empire. They also planned ultimately to restore Greek control over what had once been called Constantinople. Now, Lloyd George, in the latter part of World War I and in the immediate period afterwards, had this idea that if they could restore Christian control over what had once been known as Constantinople, that would give them good leverage against the early Soviet Union and would enable the Royal Navy to essentially block off the Black Sea. But that's another story. The point was, though, at the end of World War I, they got the opportunity to take Iraq and take Palestine and take Jordan. So if you look on the map, you can see that the British now have, by 1921, a land route through Palestine, Jordan, into Iraq, and now controlled Iraq and what's now Kuwait, and controlled, of course, what would become the incredibly profitable oil industry, because oil was discovered in all of these places shortly afterwards. It also gave them another safeguard of various routes to India. So this is a big part of the British motivation. Now, it's often said that via the Balfour Declaration and via the promises made by a certain man known as Lawrence of Arabia, to give him his screen name, made contradictory promises to the Zionists and the Arabs. That they told the Arab tribes to rise up against Ottoman rule, and that they would then be able to have their own state, and that they told the Zionists the same thing about the same patch of land. Now, I view this slightly differently. I don't view this as necessarily contradictory from the point of view of British imperialism. Now, bear in mind what I just said about British imperialism and the way in which it operated. It routinely then sought to create conflict between the two in order to then insert themselves as the peacemakers, having created the conflicts in the first place. And this is exactly what they did in Palestine. There's no, from the point of view of the British Empire, there is no contradiction between the promises made to the Arabs and the promises made to the Zionists. They meant to have it that way, because the people who ran the British Empire in the Lloyd George cabinet weren't stupid. They knew what they were doing. They needed the Arabs to rise up against the Ottomans, and they needed the Zionists then to come in order to prevent a unified Arab state, which would become a threat to them. Because if you look at the original promises that the British were making to the Arab tribes, it was about a state that would take in not just Palestine, but also Jordan and areas that are now in Saudi Arabia. Now, they didn't actually want to give that. What they wanted, because they were facing, of course, we started off the program with a look at the 106th anniversary, which is what it is today, of the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, after 1921 to 22, it became clear that the various attempts at foreign intervention in the Bolshevik Revolution and the various attempts led by the British and the French and the Americans to overthrow the new Soviet state, those attempts had failed. So they were going to have to live with it, at least for a while. Now, of course, what this helped spark was a massive upsurge in anti-colonial revolts after World War One. So the British, having finagled their way into the possession of what's known really as Palestine and Jordan, and the French taking Syria and what's now known as Lebanon under League of Nations mandates, knew that their time might be limited in terms of being able to hang on to these as direct colonial possessions. Now, of course, they tried to brutalize and repress the movement towards independence in India, but even by the 1930s, the more far-sighted of them knew that they'd have to concede some form of self-government to India. So their strategy with the Zionist movement and the Arabs in Palestine was, as I've outlined previously, and you can see this in the article that I posted from the former Communist Party MP, Scottish Communist Party MP, Willie Gallagher. He outlined this in an article he wrote in 1938, which is that the British Royal Commission on Palestine aimed to do exactly what I've just been saying. It aimed to create a Zionist state, an Arab state, and have the British with a military encampment, basically, a British zone in the middle of all of this, in order that that the Zionists and the Arabs could be kept at each other's throats, and that the British would sit in the middle, keeping the peace. Remember, if you grew up as I did in the late 80s, early 90s, so my first memories of the news have come in around about 89, 90, and I always remember the way in which the war in Ireland was portrayed in the British press. It was portrayed as, well, there's these two groups of Irish madmen who are at each other's throats and who can't be reasoned with, and therefore we need to put the British army in the middle of them to make sure that they're kept separate and they don't kill each other. Because this was the big justification for why the British army continued to sit in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. It was that the Irish, whether they were loyalist or Republican, were all insane. They were all violent brutes, and if it wasn't for the presence of the British military, then they would all devour each other. It'd be a horror show, and only Britain's presence prevents that horror. And that's the way that it was portrayed. That's the way it was talked about in popular culture at the time, and it's the way that the British always justified their continued presence anywhere in the world. Oh, well, we've got these two groups that are irreconcilable, and if we leave, well, they'll just tear each other to pieces. But of course, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the British, more often than not, created the circumstances that saw these rival religious or ethnic groups clash with each other and create violence and chaos, because it was the British who instigated the violence and chaos and then claimed that they were the only ones that could stop it. The American empire uses the same tactics. The US imperialists use the same tactics today. So, bringing it back to the question of the Zionists then, and the Zionist project. Again, let's go back. What is this created to do? It's created to do exactly what I've just described. It's created in order to create war, create chaos, attack various different Arab states, but particularly to stop what the British viewed as a dangerous move towards Arab unity. Remember the words of Ronald Storrs, the old British colonial official, that he wanted to create, and I'm quoting from his memoirs directly now, a loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. And it was designed, as Storrs said later on in his book, to act for Britain's interests, the same way the occupied 6 counties of Ireland act for Britain's interests. And this is what the Zionist state has reliably done, though, of course, it is the Americans who took over the management of the project. And what has the Zionist state done reliably to this day? And that is to attack most of all, then first of all, any nation and any leader who look like they might be able to pull the countries of the Middle East together, especially on a nationalist or socialist or pan-Arab socialist basis. So particularly Gamal Abdel Nasser, Saddam Hussein, of course, attacking directly the Palestinian Liberation Organization and PFLP, DFLP, groups like that, attacking, of course, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who regarded himself as a follower of Nasser. But pan-Arab socialism, Arab nationalism, anything that could unify the Arab people beyond religion and sectarianism and beyond, and who could unify them beyond the borders that had been artificially drawn by the colonial map makers in the 20s and 30s. That's Israel's mission, most perfectly expressed perhaps in the wars of 1956, where the British used the Zionist state exactly as it was designed to be used, which is to make a war directly on Egypt, and then the British and the French would then intervene to protect the Suez Canal, which is exactly what they did. That's the way the British sold it, was that they were intervening purely to protect the Suez Canal, and to they even attempted at one stage to portray themselves as a peacekeeping force. Whereas in reality, they were using Israel, and the Israeli regime was happy to be used in this way against a dangerous, correctly from their point of view, because Nasser was a dangerous Arab leader who was whose example and whose political project of the United Arab Republic later on was a very, very dangerous example that the British wanted to see crushed. And of course, the Americans wanted to see crushed. And it's my interpretation of in reality, it's the 5-Day War. The 5-Day War launched by Israel, though I think the hand of the US imperialists was very much behind this, launched by them on Egypt and Syria in particular, was designed to crush the development of, or stop the development of moves towards a proper United Arab Republic. That was why that war, I think, was in reality unleashed. Yes, the Israelis had their territorial ambitions, certainly, but ultimately why US imperialism and British imperialism give their sanction to that war, it's because they wanted to attack they wanted to get Israel to act as their armed force on the ground and attack and destroy the army and air force and destroy the reputation of Gamal Abdel Nasser. So this is the example. This is how Israel is of utility to the imperialists, attacking the most dangerous threats to their rule in the Middle East, acting as a nominal independent state with the US imperialists and the British imperialists standing behind them. That's the usage of Israel. And it continues to be the usage of Israel to this day. And of course, back in the day, in late 60s, early 70s, you got a much more wider pan-Arab solidarity movement, which was also a target for destruction, using Israel as the proxy. Israel's biggest targets, as I said, have always been socialist forces, nationalist forces, any national liberation forces that are operating on the ground, which the US doesn't want to go after itself for various different reasons, wants to retain plausible deniability. Well, it gets Israel to do it. Israel is, of course, the lead actor in the assassination campaign against Iranian nuclear scientists. Is Israel doing that just off its own bat? No. Israel is doing that at the direct behest of US imperialism. They wouldn't do it otherwise. It's not doing it because Benjamin Netanyahu likes the idea. They're doing it because it's a long-standing project for which they are the chosen tool of US imperialism. So this is the function that Israel was designed for. It's the function that it came into its own, into fulfilling in the Cold War period, and the function that it continues to have to this day. Now, in the post-Cold War period, of course, then you get the fake peace process, because the US imperialists had the idea that, well, if we can resolve and basically buy off the PLO leadership and have them basically run like this truncated micro non-state in the West Bank and Gaza, then, well, we can have Israel turn its attention more to external aggressions than to internal aggressions. That's what that was all about. But ultimately, it's something that falls apart, mainly because of the opposition of the Palestinian masses, put forward an opposition that Arafat in the end couldn't ignore, and he refused to sign on to the plan. Now, returning to the point of view that's put forward by Mearsheimer and others about, well, the tail is wagging the dog. The Israeli state has got too powerful. It has too many connections in Washington, and American policy is being distorted to serve the interests of Israel rather than the interests of the United States itself. This point of view, I will be absolutely blunt about it, is a absolutely stupid, ahistorical point of view that bears no resemblance to the actual reality of the relationship between the US imperialists and Israel itself. As I've just spent a large number of minutes talking about, the historic usage of Israel is to be literally the cutting edge of US imperialism, to be the element of the most violent element of US imperialism, the one that can go out and do all this shadow warfare stuff against Iran, the one that would directly attack Iraq on behalf of the US imperialists, who were playing a double game at the time in the early 1980s to stop the development of an Iraqi nuclear program, whilst at the same time the US imperialists were encouraging Saddam Hussein to continue the war against Iran, whilst at the same time selling weapons to Iran by the back door. Do you see where the template set by the British gets just taken up and taken onto an even bigger scale by the US imperialists, and the role that Israel plays within that? Now, the role that Israel has been playing in more recent years is, of course, a forward operating base for US intelligence and special forces activity, but also Israel acts as the always ever-present gun to the head, or quite literal gun to the head, of all the Arab countries, the gun to the head of Lebanon, which is only kept at bay by the fact that Israel lost two wars against Hezbollah. In the end, the one that concluded in 2000 and the one that took place in 2006. And this is, of course, the very important role that Israel is playing for US imperialism. But what about this Israel lobby, of which Mearsheimer writes and which many others point out is somehow apparently controlling the US Congress? This is simply untrue. The reason why Israel gets financial aid in large amounts, why it gets so much weaponry provided to it by US imperialism, is precisely for the reasons I've just outlined. The Middle East was identified by the British originally, all the way back in the middle 19th century, for different reasons back then, to do with, as I said, it being one of the routes to India. We identified this region as being crucial to dominate. They then became crucial to dominate in the 20s and 30s because of the discovery of large amounts of oil. And then it becomes even more important for the US imperialists because, of course, they have this need to maintain all these, not just the Saudis, but the various different ultra-reactionary Gulf states, which are all based on the oil and gas trade. And it's very important to keep those in line as well. And it's very important for US imperial strategy to keep a series of deeply reactionary, weak, corrupt, divided comprador regimes, of which Israel would be the strongest, because it would have the strongest military that would be directly supplied by the US imperialists, that it would have its own military industry, so it could, to a certain extent, supply itself, though we've seen just how limited its own supply system has actually turned out to be in recent weeks. And this strategy of keeping the Middle East under the thumb of US imperialism, of course, started to backfire a little bit when the invasion of Iraq and its occupation went sour, and the American imperialists were ultimately forced back by domestic resistance to them, and they were forced ultimately into a humiliating withdrawal, leaving only a token presence, which is now constantly under attack from the Shia militias that are linked to and perhaps ideologically inspired by Khomeini's Iran. And the role, again, this is the role that Israel plays, is that of the strongest of this series of weak comprador states, and it remains as also it is an important insurance policy to be had and held to the head of Egypt to make sure that first Mubarak and now al-Sisi behave themselves. The idea that the Israelis can raid over and still do another 5-day war and do large amounts of damage to Egypt, even though Egypt's got a pretty powerful military of its own now. How well organized, trained, and run it is rather open to question. But to get back to the point about the Israel lobby, the Israel lobby is a real thing. They do employ an awful lot of lobbyists on Capitol Hill in the United States, and they employ a certain network of them inside the London political system as well. So there's no doubt that this exists, and of course the Israeli state wants to make sure, the Israeli politicians and the Israeli bourgeois want to make sure they get as many favors out of Washington as possible, that they get the best possible financial arrangement for themselves. And they always succeed in this. Why? Because ultimately the political system in the United States is one that has practically zero anti-imperialist representation within it. The most you'll actually get would be the likes of Ron Paul, a libertarian, or these days Thomas Massey, maybe Rand Paul a little bit, speaking out about a relationship with Israel. I mean, don't take my word for it, take Joe Biden's word for it. I'm sure you've all seen the clip circulating from the mid-80s where Biden is honest about it and says, if we didn't have an Israel, it would be necessary to create an Israel to secure our interests in the region. And this is why Israel always gets what it wants, because that it's a crucial part of the American, Anglo-American system of imperialist control that is exercised over the Middle East. That's why it's still there. And it's still being effective in that role. And this, to bring it back to what's happening right now, the US imperialists and the British imperialists have a direct interest in the National Liberation Forces in Gaza and in the West Bank being utterly destroyed. If they couldn't be controlled by the corrupt Palestinian Authority, then they'll have the Israelis completely destroy them, no matter what the cost. That's why it's important to see that the actions taken by Israel against Gaza are taken with the full approval of the US and British imperialists. And the only problem that they've got is that because the cost of this is so high, what they're asking Netanyahu to do is essentially cover it up better. That's what they want. They would prefer it to be not in the news. Of course, they don't have that choice anymore, though. So what the Israel lobby is there to do, really, is to essentially police the small amounts of dissent. And this is what Professor Norman Finkelstein has written about. He's talked about the usage of the Israel lobby in his writing and work. And my view of it is, informed by him and others, that it's there as a disciplinary mechanism. It's there to make sure that there can be no deviation from US colonial policy, basically, in the Middle East. And it does that by the systematic weaponization of anti-Semitism claims, by Israel owning what Finkelstein has referred to as the Holocaust industry, and using all these tools to essentially make sure that, particularly within the Democratic Party, I mean, the recalcitrant libertarians in the Republican Party are few and far between, but that particularly the American left remains committed to, if not a defense of Israel directly, then a tacit defense of it, for fear of being accused of anti-Semitism, for fear of getting political heat thrown your way. Of course, lobbying is a very profitable industry, and there's no bigger and better funded lobby than the Israel lobby. And this is also partly because so many in the American bourgeois, whether Jewish or not, in fact, increasingly not, regard it, again, quite properly from their class positions point of view, as an American colonial project in the Middle East. And this is exactly what it is, really. It's an American colony. It started off as a British colonial project. It was taken over by the Americans, and that's what it is now. It's an American colonial project, and a lot of them, the more fanatic of them, there are, again, going back all the way to Palmerston, there is sometimes a religious or pseudo-religious reasoning drawn over this within certain elements of the American ruling class. Some of them, like the late unlamented Sheldon Adelson, were like fanatical Zionists for like religious reasons. Others have sort of elements of that sort of end times Protestantism. But mostly the real religion that ties all these people together is the religion of empire. That's what they believe in. If you look at the defenses of Israel and the fact of why, like, for instance, are the British bourgeoisie and their politicians going apeshit now, it's because they realize that the Israeli colonial project, and it is their project, the British bourgeoisie started that project with the Balfour Declaration, that it's running into an increasing amount of trouble and that it might bite the dust pretty soon. And if that bites the dust, then that is an absolutely core component of Anglo-American imperialism's control system in the Middle East kicked away. And without that, then they're going to start having real problems in terms of their ability to project power in the region. And that's why they're organizing such a frenzied and hysterical defense of it. And if we go step back further and look at this from the ideological, or should we say civilizational point of view, you also get the same kind of defenses wheeled out in defense of Israel as you got back in the day for Rhodesia or apartheid South Africa, or indeed the French in Algeria. And it's the French-Algerian question that I think is the most interesting comparison to Israel. France in Algeria and the whole question of like the French relationship with Algeria, I think is an interesting comparison to use with the American, particularly the American relationship with Israel. Because for many, many years, for over a century, it came to be seen by the French bourgeois that Algeria was literally a part of France. Of course, this wasn't true. It was a part of France if you were a settler, not if you were an Algerian, not if you were a native, as Fanon goes into. But this was a myth that they created and they told themselves, and many of them believed it. Many of them were invested in Algeria financially and ideologically. And this is why when the FLN won its war, and it did win the war, the French negotiated in the end, but only because they were losing the war and losing it badly by the end of the 1950s. And there were starting to be revolts within the French conscript army. And without a large conscript army, they couldn't sustain the military presence in Algeria, which is why in the end they negotiated with the FLN. And the political impact of losing Algeria was immense on France. First of all, to try and save Algeria, they staged a coup to bring in de Gaulle, because, of course, if they lost Algeria, it would be enormously damaging to the French profitability in the bourgeois. And the loss of it, when de Gaulle realized that the choice was either secure or try and continue holding down Algeria and potentially destabilize France itself, or get out of Algeria and save the rule of the bourgeois in France itself, he chose the latter. causing, of course, the OAS, Secret Army Organization, which is this ultra right-wing, fascist, really, or terrorist organization run by disgruntled French generals who tried to assassinate their old comrade de Gaulle on several occasions. Later on, one of the conditions for the army commanders backing him in 1968, incidentally, was the pardoning of people like Jacques Massu and others who'd been involved in the OAS. So I would compare the effect on American imperialism if Israel were to go down, were to be defeated, one way or the other, with the potential. It would be similar in political terms to the impact that Algerian freedom had on France at the time. It would be a colossal blow to the self-image of the American bourgeois. Even if their actual investments in Israel, which is basically just a big military garrison state, aren't quite as proportionally big as the French bourgeois were in Algeria, in ideological terms, it would be a devastating blow. In the terms of the ability to project power in the Middle East, it would be a devastating blow. It would cause enormous political recriminations inside the US imperialist system and inside the British one too, though to a lesser degree now because the power of British imperialism in the Middle East has slackened already. But inside America, it would create an enormous political crisis because, again, it would come down to the fact that they'd lost their primary lever for exercising pressure in that particular region. And that's the big reason why they stick with Israel no matter what, because this is their most reliable means of exercising pressure in the Middle East. If you don't want to create a situation yourself, if you don't want to create some tension yourself, you can get Israel to go out and do it for you. You can get Israel to, it's a strategic objective of US imperialism to destroy Hezbollah. That's undoubtedly the case. This is why many Lebanese and people more widely believe that the US imperialists were behind the bomb blast or the blast on the docks in Lebanon several years ago, hoping to spreading the lie that it was a Hezbollah weapons dump that had gone up. So when Israel attacks Hezbollah, Israel is doing it with the full backing and approval of the US imperialists. This is the war in 2006 had the full backing of the US imperialists, because they were convinced that this was their big chance to take out Hezbollah. It turned out it wasn't the case. It was an embarrassing defeat for the Israelis. But when Israel bombs South Lebanon and attacks Hezbollah locations, it's doing so with the full backing of the US imperialists. There's no doubt about that. Again, it's always going along with their objectives. Their other objective is to completely smash any national liberation movement inside Palestine that might inspire similar movements across the Middle East. Again, Israel, in doing what it's doing in Gaza right now, is acting fully in the interest of US imperialism. So why do people like Mearsheimer, Scott Ritter, and others persist in telling this myth? I think it's because what they're doing is, for someone like Mearsheimer, who regards himself or describes himself as a realist, he and that school of thought don't want to acknowledge fully the role that US imperialism plays. Occasionally they'll talk about, like Mearsheimer's critique on Ukraine, for instance, was that, as he puts it, that the US had led Ukraine up the primrose path, as he puts it, and had no intention of letting them into NATO. And of course that is true, but what Mearsheimer doesn't really go into in his critique is the question of why. He puts it in terms of sometimes he'll talk about the neocons or poor decision making or an obsession with fighting Russia. Of course, because he's not a Marxist, far from it, he's actually an advocate for American imperial power, but he's an advocate for what he would regard and what the realists regard as the more rational choice. Now, Mearsheimer sees the most immediate threat to US imperialism as being China. And to a certain extent, he's right. To the US ruling class, China is very threatening. And he regards the entanglement in Ukraine and the entanglement, as he sees it, with Israel as a distraction from doing what the US should be doing, which is getting ready for a full-blown war with China and putting all focus into that. Now, Mearsheimer is wrong in his assessment of where American power comes from. He thinks that it's just a question of the Chinese reaching a point where they're now outcompeting the US in various different fields of production and innovation, and then China needs to be put back in its box before things go too far. People like Mearsheimer criticize who they call the neocons, and again, I've explained before why I don't use that term. I don't think it's a term which has any value or any explanatory value. Now, those they criticize as being the so-called neocons. Their point of view, however, is more rational than the realists' point of view, because what the group referred to by their critics as the neocons have as their objective is the maintenance of what Bill Kristol referred to as full spectrum dominance. And this is what, of course, lies behind the project for the New American Century. This group, of course, that first came to light in the Reagan administration and then really came to prominence in the 90s after the publication of the Wolfowitz Memorandum. This was a blueprint for securing a global system that would be totally dominated by the United States. And their prescription for this revolved around dominance of, well, first of all, dominance of the Middle East, which is what the post 9/11 wars were all about, securing complete domination and the elimination of any regime that stood outside, even to a small degree, of the American system. That is, of course, why they made war on Yugoslavia under Milosevic. It's why they went after Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It's why they went after Syria, Libya, etc. Anything that could stand outside the American-run system, even to the slightest degree, had to be eliminated. Okay? So that's the point of view expressed in the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Wolfowitz Memo. And part of that, as we've covered when we're talking about Russia, is the need that they have to either have Russia continually run by like Yeltsin, comprador figures, or to have it broken up completely to ensure ready access could be always available to its natural resources without any barriers or very minimal barriers standing in the way. Which, of course, is why when they worked out that the Putin administration, it's not just him, of course, or the Putin administration's plural, were not prepared to go along with essentially being just a sober Yeltsin, which is what they hoped Putin would be in the beginning, which is why they were initially not overtly hostile towards him. But they never stopped trying to break bits off Russia, trying to undermine it, trying to territorially divide it up. So this is this point of view from the Wolfowitz and Bill Kristol group and Dick Cheney group was based on dominating the Middle East, either controlling Russia through compradors or seeking constantly to keep it weak by continually fueling and aiding proxy wars in breakaway regions, just the same way that they're trying to do now. And so either keep it weak or broken up, dominate the Middle East through, of course, direct occupation of Iraq. They hoped to roll on to Syria and Tehran, but then that never fully emerged, thankfully. And through the occupation of Afghanistan, they could project power into Central Asia as well. And, of course, then you ring China with US military bases, which, of course, is what they have done, and that they can keep China in a box until they're ready to, quote-unquote, deal with it. And that was the plan of the so-called neocons. And that's still their plan to this day. And the point I'm making here is that from the point of view of American imperialism, it's an entirely rational plan. You and I may find it horrifying, and indeed it is. Its effects certainly are. But if you're an American imperialist, well, what is your interest? Your interest is in this period of decaying monopoly capital, being able principally to move your capital anywhere in the world and secure the maximum possible profit on your investment for the minimum possible outlay. And that means, of course, not just in the field of energy production, which is, of course, crucial, but with regard to everything. And you need this global system that is going to be dominated by you, which enables you to exploit resources and labor anywhere in the world, that enables you to get to exploit, again, like hyper exploit labor, and then being able to bring in ultra cheap commodities into the homelands of the empire, and be able to then, of course, as part of that, keep the population at home pacified at the same time as restricting their wages, because you dominate the entire global market. And to dominate the entire global market, you, of course, need global reach. You need to be able to dominate every region. You need to be able to make sure that you have coverage everywhere, so to speak. And that's represented in the thinking, if you can call it that, of the Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz group that were so prominent in the Bush administration. But it's thinking that isn't just entirely theirs. It's a point of view of the most powerful sections of U.S. imperialism itself. So this is why I object to the term neocon. It's not a group of men with bad ideas, which is the way that the so-called realists wish to portray this as. They are a manifestation, and the reason why the people complain, the neocons always seem to be in power, that's because they're a political expression. They are the people who dominate the State Department, the Pentagon, the various think tanks, which are paid for by the American bourgeois themselves. These are all an expression of the class interests of the American ruling class, the American bourgeois. And their class interests are, of course, in continual expansion of capital all over the world, of American capital to go all over the world, the complete breaking down of any barriers to capital's movement, any barriers to investment, any barriers to extraction of profit or resources. And that's their interest. That's the interest of the American capitalist class at play. And to have the political manifestation of that is aggression everywhere all the time. So this full spectrum dominance thing isn't just an idea that a bunch of think tank guys cooked up. It's a political manifestation of the needs of the US ruling class. And so for those like Mearsheimer and people who follow along from him, who think that, if only we could have a more rational American capitalism, if only we could properly identify who our real enemies are, if we need to stop fighting everybody, we need to stop fighting Russia, and we need to stop doing favors, as they would see it, for Israel. And then we could more properly align America's interests by having dialogue here and some more confrontation here. This is a naive point of view, because it neglects the fact that as the sole imperial power with this imperialist bloc attached to it, American capitalism needs continual expansion, particularly at a time when, of course, the domestic manufacturing base has been completely hollowed out, and the interests of the American ruling class are overwhelmingly invested in the need to carry out this continual expansion of American domination all over the world for all the reasons I've just outlined. So you don't get to go to suddenly a rational, so to speak, realist approach when that is the economic underpinning of that system. The economic base is decaying and now hyper-aggressive monopoly capitalism. And that doesn't lend itself to a rational system based on America finding its place in a multipolar world, and maybe they could negotiate a deal with the Chinese. No, with a decaying and rotting system that is becoming more and more aggressive at the same time as it's becoming reorganization of the world, with a latter-day Bismarck coming along and finding America its new place. No, what you get is violent outbursts as the system and the alliances and the various mechanisms it has used to dominate all these different parts of the world goes down and down and down. You get further problems, further chaos, further bloodletting, which is what you're getting now. And so to return to the point of view about Israel, what the likes of Mearsheimer want and what the likes of Scott Ritter want are utopian ideas. They're approaches that can't happen. American imperialism now, reason why it won't bargain with Russia until it won't bargain with the Russians until the bitter end, the reason why it is absolutely fanatically attached to Israel as a colonial project is because it needs to continually pursue the breakup of Russia. It needs to continually back Israel to subjugate and divide and, if necessary, destroy large areas of the Middle East. It needs to amplify the conflict over Taiwan, using the Japanese as cannon fodder if they absolutely have to. And these are the strategies of monopoly capital in decay. It's not because you've got a bunch of lobbyists sat on, what is it, in Washington, D.C., K Street, going up to Congress and saying, hey, Congressman, I've got a compromising picture of you dressed in a boiler suit with a hamster or something, even though that might play a part in it. It's more that the Israel and its continued existence are a crucial element in the U.S. Decaying monopoly capital's bid to subjugate the entire world in order to make it a profitable investment zone, basically. And that it's a manifestation of that. And those that cling to this idea that that Israel is running U.S. politics are usually people who, for one reason or another, and if with the likes of Mearsheimer and people like Scott Ritter, it's because they believe that the American Republic as it stands today can be saved if it just draws down its foreign commitments. Well, if it draws down its foreign commitments, then American imperialism implodes and the American capitalist system goes into the deepest, darkest recession it has ever been in, and you end up with a gigantic assault upon the American working class, and a class war the likes of which you have not seen ever breaking out. You end up with a gigantic crisis internally. Those are the choices. Now, those are unpalatable for many, which is why they prefer to cling to myths about, if we could, Israel's running our foreign policy, or, if we could just negotiate with Putin, he's a decent guy, that kind of thing. No, they always miss the underpinning of this system, which is, as I will repeat it again, you get a system of decaying monopoly capital run by the single, for a long time, global superpower that designed this entire global system to benefit its ruling class and those of its acolytes in Europe and Britain. And it's on the slide, and this explains its behavior. Not poor choices, not a bunch of bad guys with bad ideas, but the material forces of decaying imperialism. That is why it maintains and will maintain Israel, to the point, as I said the other night, where the costs of maintaining it become too much to bear. Well, much like de Gaulle facing reality in Algeria in late 1950s France, if it becomes the case that there are too heavy political penalties and economic penalties to pay, where the political control inside the homeland, then France, now the United States, starts to shake, where the actual rule inside the imperial core starts to be questioned, where everything becomes destabilized as a result of their trying to cling on in Israel, then you have an extremely difficult choice, but ultimately Israel will get dumped. Just like the Afghan project was in the end dropped, just as the Banderists in Kiev will in the end be dropped, just as the Kurds in northern Syria will be dropped. Now, yes, as I said before, the dropping of Israel will create an enormous crisis inside US imperialism, but this will happen in the end, and all the lobbying in the world isn't going to save that if it's a question of drop Israel or face enormous internal problems which they might not be able to solve. Then Israel will be dropped. Right, I'll pause now for questions before drawing it to a close tonight. Greetings to Austin, and to Red Star Betty, Mike Martinez. Hello to Dan Kovalik. Good to see you here. Citizen Script says the original indispensable nation. Michael Hodgson, hello to you. Beiju says, just becoming aware of the collaboration between Zionists and Nazis to lead the Jews to their death in concentration camps. Mind-boggling horror, yeah. Once you learn of the extensive collaboration between the Zionists and the Nazis, there's no real turning back. I mean, this is a real horrifying ideology that the British helped to inflict upon the Middle East, but also now maintained by the US imperialists. And no different to many of the other horrific things that they've allied themselves with over the years. But to find the truth about the collaboration between the Zionists and the Nazis really makes you want to vomit when you see how Israeli politicians flaunt the fact that they now own the historical memory of the Holocaust. It's a real fucking insult that a group that collaborated with the Nazis gets to appropriate that legacy. Hello to Movie Maker Joe, who says, an excellent description of the usefulness of the self-engendered violence the British government structure created in Ireland as a useful example of how the environment is created by colonial capital. Glad you found it useful. David Green says, you should probably thank Chomsky for his honourable service in challenging the Mearsheimer argument. I haven't seen Chomsky's critique of the Mearsheimer argument, actually, David. Is it in a book or an article that I should consult? Because I will do. Got my criticisms of Chomsky, but credit where credit is due. Ian Foster says, imperialists encouraged and supported Zionism not because they believed in it, but because the European settler states served their own geopolitical interests. Yes, correct. DE says, same with Israeli airstrikes into Syria. Correct. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby, who's dropped in. Philbin says, excellent conference by the comrades in the CPGBML. Yes, I was there over the weekend. Excellent celebration of the Bolshevik Revolution. And Yuan said, the stupid Israeli leadership misread Nasrallah's speech. Yeah. Nasrallah said they were stupid in his speech, and he's right. But they're not the only fucking stupid ones. There's a lot of people in the West who misread it as well. And they misread it because they wanted to misread it, basically. And I'll cover more about that tomorrow. But they missed the fact that he was outlining escalatory steps that he was prepared to take. And he was giving them basically a week to basically draw things down. And they haven't. They've gone in the opposite direction, because what's happened is the same dull-witted, wishful thinking that they engaged in Ukraine, they've now engaged in the Middle East. Because every time the Russian leadership basically drew back, tried to calm things down, or tried to reach an arrangement, the dull-witted politicians in London and Washington said, no, he's weak. Quick, Zelensky, attack now. And they perpetually underestimated the Russian political leadership. And now Ukraine pays the price for it. Now many more people might pay the price for this disastrous miscalculation in the Middle East. Irish Partisan says, do you see the US imploding into chaos and a possible civil war like we saw in the 1860s? Well, I hope not. I hope that the US proletariat can get organized and to actually overthrow this system. Civil war is possible when the civilizations go on the skids. It's possible in Europe. It's possible in Britain. You got a near civil war in France when Algeria broke away. So it's possible, but I would hope that we could, thanks to the experience of the last 100 years and thanks to the experience and the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, I hope that we can organize ourselves as communists sufficiently to avoid that. But it's a possibility if the gigantic implosion that is coming is carried through without a coherent proletarian response to it, and you end up with ruling class factions fighting each other, or the ruling class stirring up a civil war to try and preserve itself. Philbin says, recently got a glimpse of daunting media landscape UK comrades face with the so-called debate between James Lindsay and Aaron Bastani. Literally could not finish watching these narcissists. Worthless. Yeah, well, Navarra is a fucking worthless organisation. Bastani is just a younger Paul Mason. I mean, like, why anybody still watches that, I don't know. He completely shat his pants over the anti-Semitism thing. and managed to do the same recently. He's just another tone policer, another sort of institutional leftist, Bastaniist, who wants to find his place in the respectable end of the commentariat, and for that reason he's willing to rat out anybody who he sees as stepping outside of that. Forget him. But Irish Partisan says, don't forget the Slavoj Žižek impression. It's true, I did promise this, so here we go. Let me just warm up. Let me just picture something that Žižek might say and get ready to sniff considerably. It is worth emphasizing that we must back Israel because Israel has the best porno industry in the world. It is true that many people say that Marxists should not engage in pornography, but I found that the brothels in Israel are some of the greatest in the world. Now, that's the Žižek impression for tonight. I could do a whole hour on that, but I feel that my voice and my nasal cavities would suffer from the consequences. So on that devastating revelation, I will leave you for this evening and return to you tomorrow night, possibly with even more impressions. But now I'm going to flip you back to our musical accompaniment. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in tonight, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Небо утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И нам